Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Rablick. Thank you for joining me for this particular podcast. Now, Australians are in the middle of a debate on defence issues at very different levels, all different levels actually, including underwater. A recent announcement of the Australian, American, British deal on submarines has caused an absolute ruckus. And part of that is because of the viewpoint expressed by uh, a former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, the very colourful viewpoint, who's known for colour, who's also expressed in the National Press Club. It was broadcast the across the world, not just within Australia. He's received plaudits from some people. He's received brickbats from others. But what is significant about it is it is a an example of political communication that uh, needs to be thought about in a particular light. How does this impact on an audience? What is a result of political communication like the political communication Keating engaged in? And then, of course, where do you take it from there? Now, joining me is Professor Tom Clark. He's a professor teaching politics at Victoria University, and we're going to chat about this and sort of tease out some of the issues. Tom, thank you for joining me for this particular episode.
Cheers, Tom. Great name. Um, Teaching and researching political communication, rhetoric, and poetry are where I come from. And there was a time when I was doing a PhD on poetry in English, and I was also working as a speechwriter for a premier. And my career has kind of joined those two up ever since, where I'm looking for the ways that political language moves us or moves the society around us, and how people respond to that.
Okay, so what Paul Keating did last week, you did right in your bailiwick in terms of language and its impacts. Well, what are the significant things that you noticed when you observed the presentation Keating gave?
I was really struck by the interpersonal dynamic first, actually. So I wasn't watching the address live. I came back to it after people started talking about it, and I thought, oh, well, that's something to catch up with here. Um, so knowing that there was a bit of a Barney, I was struck by how how constructively the relationship between Keating and Laura Tingle opened, and how constructively they kept on talking all the way through, even as Tingle got more critical in her in her her comments and observations as it went along. The respect between them stayed really noticeable, and then that they were together in Sydney, and there was a video link to the other questioners in the National Press Club in Canberra, and that relationship, Keating and journalist one, Keating and journalist two, Keating and journalist three, cabs off the rank, just deteriorated as the session went on. And so some people later on were asking questions that I thought were far more reasonable than Keating gave them credit for. Um, but, he, but it was like he needed Tingle to keep on pointing out the good faith that was on their side of the story as well. And then, of course, they duly repaid him for his classic sobriquet and brickbats by making the story all about how confrontational his approach is, when in fact he was running a line of critique that is incredibly important, because he's critiquing Australia's defence disposition, right? The Australian government is lining up who is going to shoot whom if the chips go down, and under what circumstances. And there's nothing more important for people with knowledge and understanding to critique and to weigh up. So I thought it was an incredibly important intervention by Keating into national debate, and at the same time, his inability to recognise good faith when he saw it was more than matched by journalists' inability or unwillingness to recognise the constructiveness of his input.
Let's expand upon that last point. because I think that's that's fertile territory for examination, um, and that is, you know, substance can be lost in form. Um,
Yeah.
by that I mean, if you cloak your address or your writing in invective, no matter how much invective there is, you run the risk of the central point being lost, don't you?
Yeah. So I'll try not to be too theoretical for too long, but one of the core propositions of all study of meaning is that meaning is content, the form, and the function. It's what it's said, it's how it's said, and it's why it's said. And we're forever reaching for little bits of evidence about what someone's saying, how they're saying it, why they're saying it. And you and I might hear different bits or see different bits, and so we come to different interpretations of what Paul Keating said, or what Phil Curry asked him, or what Laura Tingle corrected near the end of the program, the session. But so there is always this balancing going on between what is said, how it's said, and what is driving up why it's being said. And I think that wrestle plays out really clearly, as you say, in the question of invective versus serious comment, or the question of confrontational adversarial discussion versus collegial collaborative discussion. Um, so much of our system of governance is premised on adversarial setups, and we think adversarial is a bad word, but like a prosecution and a defence is a guarantee of justice in some quarters. A government and an opposition is a guarantee of serious governance in Parliament. So that we've kind of set ourselves up to misunderstand each other in lots of ways, and yet that's and that is necessarily the way we resolve public discussion.
But if we go back and I refer to a piece I've written for Crikey here, but if we go back far enough into the roots of Western philosophy with John Stuart Mill and Thomas Paine and others, what we see is people grappling with the nature of opinion, nature of expression,
Mm.
and also the need to listen to and respect another's opinion, however wrong we may believe they can be. I mean,
Indeed, yeah,
and so if you look at even with the correction that transpired at the end of that particular session, uh, Keating was corrected on on the assumption of what actually happened with Penny Wong
yeah, yep,
doing
yep,
it right. Um, that looked sloppy, and fair enough. You know, if you're going to go in hard and lead with your chin, you've also got to expect that you get a blow back.
yeah,
But the John Stuart Mill says even if someone is wrong, even if an opinion is erroneous, there may be some grain of truth within it.
yeah,
And unless you allow for that to be expressed and evaluated against what might be a popular um, opinion or a consensus view, you don't know what you're missing in the single view or the orthodoxy that's in place.
yeah. Mill has such a friendly, collaborative tone about his writing. It's easy to overlook how his is a theory of adversarial justice. Yeah,
Yeah,
prosecution defense is an enlightenment approach to ensuring that both sides of the story get told, and we now believe there are more than two sides of a story in many ways, but still there's a guarantee in that. Uh, Mill is kind of arguing that the test of good government or good governance is disagreeing well. And I think Tingle actually has a really good grasp of that, and that's why both the journalists at one end and Keating at the other end kind of trust her as a vehicle for their often fractious conversation.
it's an interesting point we're getting into there because when you look at what unfolded on Wednesday last week, when you look at the presentation that people, by the way, can look up and watch on YouTube. Just have a
And iView.
and
And iView.
iView
Yep.
with the
Yep.
ABC.
Yep.
Um, the that it is worthwhile having a look at it if you're fascinated about the way in which the media and former Prime Minister interacted and what transpired, because some of the pyrotechnics will no doubt amuse you, but some of it will be annoying. In fact, there is one I will raise which you will remember, um, and that was fascinating. And I've criticised Keating on this on Twitter, and didn't appear in my piece today. My piece today deals with other issues related to public debate and John Stuart Mill's philosophy and whatever have you. But um, there was a question asked about Keating, and I paraphrase, whether he actually knew enough to be certain that his judgment on the threat assessment of China was sufficient or contemporaneous enough. Olivia Paisley went down that road from Sky News, and he talked about the fact he had a brain and he could read. How did you find that encounter in terms of that exchange? Because the question to me was entirely reasonable.
Yes, I think the question is entirely reasonable, and he could have given an answer to it that would have entirely vindicated his position. But he, I'm speculating here. I think he was just getting grumpy, and so he decided that he was sick of questioning of his authority. So I'm not very sympathetic to his answer, but in the discussion of threat, people kind of willfully gliding over the difference between risk and threat. Yeah, so a threat in the sense of somebody threatening or a party threatening is quite different from the material risk that is posed simply by a party, but by China's capability, or for that matter, by America's capability. If the next time that's January the 6th that pans out the other way, and America becomes a radically unreliable ally, then possibly America's capability is a real problem for us. Yeah, um, I would love to see a stronger distinction between risk and threat in the discussion here, because we
But
can
it,
quite quickly make it about more than China. And I think Keating's answer there could have been, I'm questioning the government's risk assessment. Yeah, and
well,
if he
but
makes it always about
you need to.
threat, if he makes it always about threat, then he misses Richard Marles and others saying no, it's about risk. And I mean, they're not spelling out the distinction clearly enough either. Then maybe they think it's too fine grained, but it's really important.
It's actually not too fine grained. I think if you take the position that uh, the government is about risk management and risk assessment, um, you need to explain to people in some form what risk assessment actually is,
Mm.
and
And
how.
Keating used to be really good at that kind of explaining. He probably still is, right? He could give it a crack.
But your problem with that format, which was a dialogue with Laura Tingle rather than a speech presented that and gave him the opportunity to deliver his thoughts as he had written them,
Yeah.
and distributed them to the press gallery beforehand. 9 pages, as somebody on Twitter said to me, 9 pages. Well, that's all very well and good, but if the audience hasn't observed him delivering the 9 pages, they have no context of what he wrote.
Yes, you could see him
Um,
chafing with that, couldn't you? Because he was trying to quote his own transcript, which was a bit awkward.
yeah, but if it was delivered in more of a traditional presentation, then then the audience watching would have been given the complete context of his thoughts, and the questions would have then flowed on from that. But it's kind of a game when the only people that have actually seen the documents are people in the press gallery in attendance, and you haven't seen the written word. All you're seeing is people engaging with each other about something that you loosely work out is about AUKUS, as it goes and proceeds, but you don't get to see the actual document, the primary document on which it's based, unless, of course, you follow the right journalists on Twitter who ended up screenshotting everything for the convenience of the people who could actually read that tiny print from their screenshot, which I can't.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it sort of it's the conspiracy of the exclusive exclusivity of that environment as well that may have cut some people out of understanding it better.
Yeah.
What other things did you notice in the discourse with Keating that interested you?
Um, so I know he was the only, I think, if I remember this rightly, he was the only person to mention Taiwan or Hong Kong, and yet they are two of the obvious weak points in his line of criticism. Yeah, so journalists weren't asking about it, and more, latterly, insiders talked a bit about Taiwan and Hong Kong, but um, on the Sunday morning. But really, Keating's argument about threat being a manifest intention to take on is quite tested, I think, by the Taiwan scenario. If there's some kind of confrontation around Taiwan, then Australia is potentially collateral in that, whether we want it or not, whether we have those submarines or not. And so, and to strengthen his argument, it probably happens before the submarines arrive anyway, right? So
Well, that's the curious thing that I was.
he raised it, which I think is a volatile ground for his critique. He raised it, and nobody else questioned him about it. I thought, oh, that's like, is there a lack of circumspection among the people listening to him, whether or is it just kind of freak of an hour and nobody thought at that point in that time? But I can't believe it. They're clever people on the case. They think about this stuff more and better than I do, and it was just weird that it never came back.
I think you'll find that if you looked at Sky News and other and certain commentators on there, Stephen Conroy, the former minister of the Rudd Gillard government,
Yeah,
from so I don't think he served Rudd in the second when Rudd managed his second coming. Um, but Conroy basically read out a list of things that Keating hadn't addressed, from the properly addressing the Uyghur issue, properly addressing in more substance the issues to do with Hong Kong and China's
yeah,
recalcitrance in Hong Kong, all of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Um, so it,
And Tinkle did ask him about the Uyghurs, right?
yeah, it did, but it wasn't. Keating went on to talk a bit more about that being sort of contested at one point during his presentation.
Yeah,
But the point being, um, his at one point he referred to Aboriginal debts in custody and incarceration of Indigenous populations. So it's a he adopted the argument, if I can be biblical for a moment, of trying to remove the the splinter from your somebody else's eye when you've got to log
yeah,
in your own.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but it wasn't necessarily welcomed by some commentators, but they didn't see it as an equivalent criticism.
No,
Uh,
it's a very inconvenient thing that we have to reflect on our own performance when we're busily appraising everybody else's. But he's onto something.
well, the question, yeah, but that's always the case. Even on the day we're recording this particular conversation, there's been an arrest in relation to the um, uh, issues being investigated related to alleged war crimes in Afghanistan. Um, Anyone that's got a bit of a memory would know that China's foreign affairs wolf warriors had picked up and run with the tweets on the Brereton report released a few years back now. So you've talking about somebody else's human rights record does inevitably bring the focus on our own or instances of alleged breaches of human rights and conduct in war.
Mm.
Um, that is inconvenient. You're right, but you've got to work out how you contest an argument on that basis internationally.
And I mean, I think the really kind of glaring um, form or function um, take on Keating's National Press Club address, but also his 7:30 report and the speech he gave, his 7:30 report interview, um, uh, is that of course he's a former Prime Minister. He's also from the Labor Party, but he's a former Prime Minister engaging in public criticism of a strategic policy decision that has been locked in. So Gillard hasn't gone there. Howard hasn't gone there. Rudd hasn't gone there because he's now got a job. That means he really can't. But Keating and Turnbull and Abbott saw fit to, and that's the, you know that the convention that past prime ministers give space to current prime ministers to carve out strategic policy for themselves was probably an important convention. And if we don't have that anymore, it's going to become a different kind of policy debate for Australia for a long time.
Okay, now you raised an interesting question. Former prime ministers have a prominent voice because they've been everywhere. They've been seen, they've run things, etc. Um, uh, if a conversation needs to be had, and we exclude former prime ministers who are public figures from it, where does um, a counter argument on policy positions on defence or other issues come from?
It's a very good question, isn't it? There are real limitations around the convention of respect. I note that there seems to be pretty clear agreement that every time Keating tries to ring Albanese, he gets through. That seems to be the consensus from both ends. I imagine that Turnbull and Abbott, if they tried to ring Albanese, they'd probably get through at least the first time they tried. So these people do have lines into policy that I wouldn't have, and I don't know about you, but plenty of people wouldn't have. They do have networks. If Keating wants an argument run, he's got plenty of people who are current in the game who can run with lines of argument if he persuades them. But the convention has been about taking up the megaphone yourself as an ex-prime minister, and I completely accept the legitimacy of your question, right? That if we say no, ex-prime minister shouldn't have a megaphone or shouldn't have it in these policy areas, then we are possibly limiting ourselves. But if we give them the megaphone on these policy issues from now on, that's different to what we've been assuming till now.
There's another problem that we ought to raise, and that is if we permit the discourse, um, these issues in the way it has occurred in this space more frequently, uh, then there's a benefit in terms of an argument being raised and things being tested in the marketplace of ideas. But there's another problem, and that is adversaries have a propaganda advantage,
Mm.
and that is they say they'd be quite happy, easily led into a conversation where they say, hold on, a former prime minister today said that the Australian government's policy on a particular, deal and engaging with America and the United Kingdom is absolutely wrong. So you've got the double-edged sword, which is in the domestic environment, it may help chest ideas may help firm people up, but it creates but it can do harm. There's a negative somewhere in there where the possible adversary, um, in any conflict or through economic coercion or whatever it happens to be, which they tell us China is letting us go a bit, that
And
they're
now,
letting
yeah,
it go. But how do you ride that wave?
I mean,
It's really the question. It's a complex issue. Do you, yeah, somebody of the significance of a former prime minister saying, "How dare you go down this road? It's wrecked the track record of the Labor Party for a century." Um, Gives some people an insight into possible arguments, but adversaries are able to use it to talk the country down.
so there's a really interesting main point in your question. There's also an interesting side point about the track record of the Labor Party. It'd be good to take up that one in a sec as well. Um, I think on the main point, the importance of that becomes really apparent in an age where social media narrowcasting is coupled with analytics, and so people engaging in the discourse game in bad faith are able to confuse and thwart good public discourse rather than enhance and broaden it or deepen it. And we've certainly seen that in foreign interventions into election processes, including in this country, but much more spectacularly in some countries overseas. So we really do have to watch out for it. And I think ultimately the only adequate defence against that is a better educated electorate, which is a very John Stuart Mill argument. Actually, a better educated electorate is the best
Yeah.
is the best guarantee of people distinguishing between good faith and bad faith arguments. Yeah, and
Now, how do we do? How do we do that? You're in the
oh,
education.
everyone should enrol in my courses. No, no,
Well, aside from Victoria University
yeah,
getting a free promotion,
yeah. Sorry,
there's an issue. There's an issue of principle here,
yeah.
and that is how do we do it? Because using me as myself with the case study, um, I went to a private secondary college. Um, the major grounding in philosophy was in sort of our religious education periods, and whatever it was that was chosen for us in terms of topics for politics, um, in English and in literature. In English, we were blessed, um, at the time, at least in my view, because somebody in their wisdom decided to select the topic, power and politics. So we ended up reading The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, Orwell's 1984, Robert Bolt's The Man for All Seasons, and we also got to explore a book that's an anthology of Nelson Mandela's speeches called No Easy Walk to Freedom.
Mhm.
Right?
Great reading list.
Yeah, that reading list, um, sort of remains a foundation for some of my thinking. But we didn't get On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. We didn't get Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, and in fact, going to a Catholic college, Age of Reason would not appear on the reading list, given what it says about organised religion.
Mm.
Um, which basically Thomas Paine said that organised religion sucks. If you want the thesis, if you want the thesis, but what are the things that as an educator that help critical thinking, um, uh, and that could sit within a curriculum?
So I think you're never going to get everyone to read everything. You're never going to get everyone to read everything that's good. So you need to focus on using the resources that are available a reasonable sample of the resources that are available to build the skills. What skills are we talking about? I think it goes back to that idea of skills for disagreeing well. So teaching people to see different sides of the story, teaching people to argue their side of the story respectfully and learn from each other, um, encouraging skills of curiosity and research and weighing up evidence and attempting to be proportionate in handling each other's arguments. The more practice people get at arguing well and disagreeing well, the better able they are and the more confident they are to set the rubbish aside. And that's my constant experience of teaching at university level, but it was also my memory of learning at a high school level. Yeah, I think you have to focus on the skills of disagreeing well. Every in a democracy, everybody governs everybody, and so we're inculcating generations of governors as well as generations of the governed. Yeah,
Um, how do you navigate that as an educator in an environment where your students are uh, you know, subject to you know, social media? How does that add some twists and turns to what you do in the classroom environment?
well, we teach using social media among other resources. If I'm trying to teach examples of good faith negotiation and bad faith propagandizing, I can use social media as examples of both. I wouldn't ever use only social media. I would use broadcast media, and I would use historical documents and correspondence. But it's really important that people can see social media as one of the landscapes where these questions matter.
Now, you've been extremely generous with your time. I've been talking to Professor Tom Clark from Victoria University about some of the implications of the way in which we, as a community, have engaged in debate on the AUKUS submarine deal, particularly sparked after Paul Keating had a former prime minister had a crack at the current government and the former government on national security issues. Tom, if people want to know more about the type of things you teach and what you're involved in, where do they go?
You can go into reading about political rhetoric, and you can also go into reading about literature and poetry, and the two fields really do converge. They're both trading in meaning, trading in stories. When I was working as a speechwriter, I realized that I didn't, unlike say the poets I was studying, I didn't have maybe a line count. 14 lines for a sonnet. I didn't have maybe a rhyme scheme, A B or whatever. But I had a number of minutes. I had a number of topics that had to be said and a number of topics that couldn't be said. I had a story that needed to work its way through those rules, which was inherently like the challenge of poetry. And so whether you come at it from a kind of a literary purist approach to meaning, or whether you come at it from a political applied approach to meaning, actually they converge on the same fundamental questions. What are people saying? How are they saying it? Why are they saying it?
If you want to know more about the work of Professor Tom Clark, you might also jump on the VU website. He's got a biography over there. You can check out his background and the work he does at Victoria University. Tom, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you likewise, Tom. A real pleasure to discuss.
Thank you. Hope we can do it again sometime.